So a very good afternoon, one and all. So as my title suggests, so I'm going to use combination probes and optical tweezers to see if we can effectively map magnetic environments within the given sample. Okay. So what is exactly a combination probe? So what I have here is a dielectric microsphere. I have used a 1 micrometer silica microsphere, which is trapped in an optical tweezer, a conventional single beam Gaussian optical tweezer. And to the suspension of the microbeads that I have, I add dilute quantities of nanoparticles. In this case, ferrofluid particles, because they are magnetic in nature. And this in combination with each other is what I'm calling as a combination probe. So the first question that, I'm sorry, I don't know what I pressed. Yeah, this. Sorry, yeah. The first question that one would ask is, you are having an optical tweezer. We have nanoparticles. Basically, they are all commercially procured. And what we have is they are not agglomerating. So they are basically individual particles. So the company tells us. So the way they're kept apart is usually with a surfactant so that there is a repulsive force between them and do not agglomerate. So whenever you have an electric field, the nanoparticles will obviously, the surface charge on the nanoparticles will respond to the electric field. And the first question one would ask is, are you trapping the nanoparticles themselves? So thing is, we do not engineer or we do not change any of the surface properties or polarizability of our nanoparticles to, we do not intentionally do anything to the nanoparticles. This is as it is nanoparticles that we have. And neither are we doing anything to the optical trap, like creating a plasmonic trap or any such thing. The literature survey that we've done tells us that until and unless you have a very high polarizability or you're using some modification to your conventional optical tweezers, it is not possible to actually trap even whether it's a cluster of nanoparticles or even single nanoparticles. And even our experiments, which I have carried out using quadrant photodetectors, they do not show enhanced scattering. We do not see any kind of stray scattering, backscattering that is coming from the laser which I'm using for trapping. So basically, we conclude that the conditions for stable trapping of nanoparticles is not possible in our setup. And this is a schematic of the experimental setup that we have. And all my measurements are basically done on the quadrant photodetector. Right. So basically what we started doing was looking at the position fluctuations of the trapped microsphere in the presence and in the absence of the nanoparticles. So what we started to observe was that we looked at the scatter plots and the position histograms. And we estimated the full width at half maximum in the absence and in the presence of the nanoparticles. And we saw that there is a shrinking of the full width at half maximum, basically telling us that there is some kind of a confinement of the trapped microsphere in the optical trap. Then you have nanoparticles in the suspension. So we also looked at the power spectral density. So the power spectral density revealed to us that while we have a certain corner frequency associated with the trapped microsphere. Again, in the presence of the nanoparticles in the suspension, the value of the corner frequency that we were estimating was actually increasing. And for different, as the ferrofluid concentration or the nanoparticle concentration was increased, we found that this corner frequency value is actually going up as well. Right. So what we started realizing was, if I go back to the previous slide here, there's a certain, so we did it for 3 different laser powers. And what we were seeing was there is a certain flattening of the corner frequency, and only beyond a certain concentration of the nanoparticles in the suspension, we were starting to see an enhancement. So we wanted to kind of see at what value and how it is changing with power, at what values we are going to start seeing the enhancement. So what we found was, as we increase the laser power, and as a function of the nanoparticle concentration, we saw that we require higher concentrations of the nanoparticles if you are going to start to see an enhancement of the corner frequency for a strongly trapped particle. Now, the idea behind this is basically if you have a weak trap, then it is more easily, the nanoparticles seem to influence the confinement of the trapped microsphere much more easily. But a stronger trap is very oblivious to the presence of the nanoparticles. You require more particles to come and interact with your microsphere if you are going to see a change in your trap stiffness over and above that of what is coming from the laser alone. We also carried out autocorrelation function analysis So the nice thing was that the autocorrelations without and with the nanoparticles both showed exponential decays. So we were still working in a regime where we can look at the microsphere to be sitting in a harmonic potential. There's no deviation from that. So that was something which was relieving, I would say. Again, the relaxation time as a function of the concentration kept dropping, which told us that as you increase the nanoparticle concentration in the suspension, you are pushing or you're confining your microsphere to actually reduce its Brownian fluctuations. You're constraining it further and further into the optical trap. We wanted to see if this is a universal property, if it is anything to do with the magnetic property. Although the trapped microsphere was non-magnetic, we just wanted to eliminate this and also establish, in some sense, a universality. So we carried out the same set of measurements, exact same set of measurements with zinc oxide nanoparticles, which are non-magnetic. And we also found that, just like, of course, I didn't show that graph, but we found that there was a nice isotropy in the measurements in the X and Y directions, in the plane of the trapping plane, basically. So we found that the autocorrelation function, again, was a nice exponential fall off, and it was reducing in comparison to when there was no nanoparticles in the suspension. So what do we think is happening here? So this is essentially, let's say, my plane where I'm probing the Brownian fluctuations. This is the laser propagation direction. Now, because there is an electric field gradient present, there is a gradient, of course, because it's a radial electric field. So as you move away from the trap center, the electric field is actually going to die down. Now, we have nanoparticles everywhere in the suspension. So the moment the laser is switched on and you have the probe particle which is sitting in the optical tweezer, the surface charge on the nanoparticles will start to interact with the electric field gradient. So they are drawn towards the trap center. Now, as they start moving towards the trap center, if there was randomness in the way they were moving, then I should not be seeing any kind of an increase in the corner frequency or a decrease in the relaxation time. So what we feel is that although we are not able to visualize it, our measurements tell us that because there's a radial electric field which is present, the nanoparticles are actually moving in a directed motion. And this directed motion is actually responsible to just push the microsphere into a deeper potential, if I can use that term. And because of this, it stops, and there is, as the nanoparticles are moving in from all directions, they will collide with the microsphere. There is a momentum transfer. And because the momentum transfer is from this end and this end is vectorially cancelling out, so there's this particle which is being almost caged into the optical trap. So this is our conjecture, basically. And this is essentially very important, because the dynamics of these nanoparticles are actually affecting the Brownian fluctuation of a trapped microsphere. And if there is any kind of a change in the dynamics, we actually see that it reflects in the Brownian fluctuations of the microsphere. So this is essentially like the nanoparticles are talking to us through the trapped microsphere. They are telling us how they are behaving in the optical trap. So, right. Now, the next thing is to look at the response to various magnetic environments. So what we did was, if this is the laser propagation direction, we just placed bar magnets around the sample. So in the plane of the sample, we positioned bar magnets at different positions. And what we started to see was, that what was earlier a perfect superposition of the values of the X corner frequency and the Y corner frequency, now there was an anisotropy which was starting to develop. And this, of course, the anisotropy was seemingly stable. The isotropy was seemingly stable for high laser powers, and at very large concentrations of the nanoparticle, we would start to see the deviation, whereas that was not the case for the lowest power. So the dynamics of the nanoparticles is not just dependent on what its magnetic environment is, it is also depending on what kind of an electric field it is actually visualizing. So when we switched the magnet positions to perpendicular positions, as I shown earlier, we found a beautiful flip in the X and Y values. So basically, depending on how your field lines are present in the sample or how the magnetic nanoparticles are looking at field lines, their dynamics is completely changing, and that is getting reflected on how they're interacting with your trapped microsphere. So that is the real nice part of it. The flip was almost identical. So then we went ahead and just increased the complexity of the system. We placed 2 bar magnets now. So now what we have is what I've called as the parallel configuration, where the poles, basically you have parallel poles facing each other. So this is viewed as an exaggerated case of a single magnet, where the anisotropy is growing farther apart as compared to a single magnet. Now when we flipped the parallel configuration to the anti-parallel configuration, what we found was the anisotropy is starting to reduce. So this is essentially, if one were to draw the field lines for an anti-parallel configuration, we will actually end up with a zero field or a near zero field region, wherein it's almost like there is no more external magnetic field or field gradient which is present, and these nanoparticles are almost behaving like they're seeing only the optical trap. So next what we did was we tried to locally change the magnetic environment by suspending magnetic beads. So we picked 2 variants. One was a ferromagnetic bead, and the other was what we have called as a polystyrene composite magnetic beads. The problem is, no matter how much I sonicated, how much I vortex mixed, I was not able to basically break these clusters or these chain formations. So we take it that they are primitive to the kind of beads that we are looking at. Again, they were all commercially procured. So what we found was, in the presence of these magnetic beads, we started to see a complete change in the way the microsphere, which was the non-magnetic microsphere, which is still what is talking to us, it started to show a change in its position fluctuations. While with the ferromagnetic beads, we were seeing trends which were kind of similar to that when only the magnetic nanoparticles were present. It was the PMBs which kind of gave us the surprise. We found that the corner frequency value of the trapped microsphere actually increased and then it decreased and came back to almost its identical, came back to a value almost identical to what was it started with. So what we feel is that when the nanoparticles, we did some image analysis as well. So when the nanoparticles were added to these beads, so the ferromagnetic beads basically changed their primitive structures. They went from clusters to chain and back to clusters. Whereas the paramagnetic beads, or the PMBs, I wouldn't call it paramagnetic, the PMBs, basically they started off maximally as chains and went on to become clusters, but then the number of chains were not restored. So that is what we observed. And what we believe is happening is, in the case of the ferromagnetic beads, FMBs, the clusters themselves are now behaving like attractors to the magnetic nanoparticles, and there is definitely some kind of a surface charge present on the FMB clusters as well. So they will now interact with the electric field, they will start to come, and beyond a certain point where the electric field gradient overwhelms the magnetic interaction between the cluster and the nanoparticle, they will leave the clusters. Now you have more number of nanoparticles coming in, and therefore you see an enhancement beyond that of when you see only when you have only nanoparticles present. But in case of the PMBs, what we found was chains, being elongated structures, do not move all that easily because they have a higher drag on them. And we also believe that the nanoparticles themselves are participating in the making of breaking of the chains and making of the clusters in case of the PMBs. So as you have clusters actually help in enhancing corner frequencies, whereas chains impede it simply because of the difference in the drags. So as these agglomerated structures gather around the optical tweezer, it's like a hydrodynamic effect which is being seen as an effect on the non-magnetic microsphere. So this is essentially what we have, that although the effect can be attributed, right now we are attributing it to hydrodynamics, although the effect is completely hydrodynamics, the fact that the structures themselves are being changed because of the presence of nanoparticles tells us that this is in some way we can probe magnetic environments. So what else has been done? We have basically looked at the same set of measurements with the beads and nanoparticles in the presence of different magnetic field gradients. We've also used it to sense temperature changes, viscosity changes, chemical changes in chemical environment. And we also did experiments where we changed the non-magnetic bead to a magnetic bead, and we started to see very interesting and more possibilities in sensing. So the entire set of studies has been done under Dr. Bhattacharjee, and these are my lab members, and happy to take questions. Thank you.